Plato believed that people can become so adjusted to a distorted perception of reality that eventually the distortion stops feeling visible at all. This is the real tension underneath the allegory of the cave, where prisoners spend their entire lives chained inside a cave watching shadows projected onto a wall, gradually mistaking those shadows for reality itself. The prisoners don't question the shadows because the shadows have become familiar. Their perception has adjusted the shadows to a sense of reality before examining its legitimacy. And according to Plato, this is the default condition. The result is that contradictions stop feeling like simple disagreements and more as threatening disorientation. This is what makes Plato's philosophy far more unsettling than a story about ignorance. Human beings don't usually construct their perception through constant examination. Perception typically gets interpreted after it settles through exposure first. This is part of what Plato is trying to point towards in the cave. The prisoners are not deliberately choosing illusion over reality. They've simply adjusted to a version of reality that has remained consistent long enough to stop feeling questionable. Everyone around them responds to those same shadows as if they were normal. Eventually, perception adjusts accordingly. When something becomes familiar enough, scrutiny tends to decrease. Not that people are incapable of thinking carefully, but constant reevaluation would make stable perception almost impossible. The mind naturally reduces friction around what appears repeatedly and without interruption. Over time, repeated exposure creates a kind of perceptual smoothness. Things stop standing out or demanding examination. The result is that people often inherit structures of interpretation before they consciously develop reasons for them. Language works this way, so does social norms. Even assumptions about success, status, intelligence, or morality often work this way. Long before a person begins examining these structures directly, they learn what feels normal inside the environment they were shaped within. This is why familiarity can become difficult to separate from truth, because the feeling of obviousness is not always produced by deep understanding. Sometimes it's produced by repetition itself. A perception encountered consistently enough can begin feeling self-evident even when it has never been seriously examined. And according to Plato, this creates a dangerous condition because stable perception creates confidence automatically. When perception adjusts to a familiar structure, reality begins getting interpreted through that structure continuously, often without the structure itself remaining visible. At that point, people are observing reality through assumptions that have already been normalized. This is what gives the cave its weight. The prisoners are confined physically, but the deeper limitation is perceptual. Their understanding of reality is being shaped inside a closed environment where the same images, interpretation, and reactions repeat continuously without interruption. Over time, the shadows stop appearing partial and they become the standard through which everything else is interpreted. Since everyone inside the cave shares the same structure of perception, the illusion gains reinforcement in addition to familiarity. This matters because people rarely evaluate perception in isolation. Understanding develops as a collective. So when an environment repeatedly confirms the same interpretations, those interpretations begin feeling increasingly stable regardless of whether they're true. The result is a kind of interpretive enclosure, not necessarily because alternative perspectives are impossible, but because the environment gradually reduces the incentive to look beyond itself. The prisoners don't recognize the limits of their perception because their perception has already adjusted to the limits available to them. This is why Plato's concern extends beyond simple deception. The cave is an entire structure of perception becoming normalized through repetition and collective reinforcement. Eventually, the prisoners are no longer comparing the shadows against reality. The shadows have become reality within the boundaries of the world they know. When perception settles that completely, contradiction starts becoming difficult to process. Because reason itself is already operating from assumptions the environment helped produce, and now the structure organizing interpretation no longer appears structured to the people using it. So really what makes the cave dangerous are the distortions that nobody from the inside knows are distortions. If perception becomes stable through familiarity and reinforcement, then contradiction arrives as disruption. This is part of what Plato is pointing towards when one of the prisoners leaves the cave and struggles to adjust to the outside world. The problem is that the prisoner's perception has already adjusted to a structure that felt complete. When perception settles around a familiar structure, opposing information rarely feels like a small correction. This is why people often react defensively to contradictions even when they claim to value truth. Because contradiction isn't always encountered rationally before it's encountered emotionally. It'll produce confusion, uncertainty, embarrassment, or hostility before careful evaluation is fully considered. This is a fairly natural resistance because your perception is being forced to adjust around something unfamiliar. Removing that structure creates instability because of how its innate familiarity gives coherence to reality. It shaped what appeared trustworthy, what appeared meaningful, and how the world was interpreted. Clarity will naturally be a difficult response after stripping that away. This is why Plato does not portray liberation from the cave as immediately comforting. The prisoner will initially struggle outside the cave because perception itself has to adjust. During that transition, certainty collapses faster than understanding can be built. That process is difficult since stable perception creates attachment over time. The longer a structure organizes someone's understanding of reality, the harder it becomes to separate truth from familiarity. And according to Plato, this is part of why distorted perceptions can persist even when contradictions become visible. People are protecting the structure that allow reality to feel coherent. The play becomes even more powerful once perception is reinforced collectively, because the prisoners aren't experiencing the shadows alone. Everyone around them responds to the same structure of reality as though it's obvious. Over time, that collective agreement creates additional stability around the illusion. This matters because human beings are sensitive to social reinforcement, making it difficult to completely separate perception from the collective. Questions could easily create friction within the group that help stabilize the perception in the first place. So when a belief, behavior, or interpretation is continuously reinforced by an environment, questioning it begins carrying more than just uncertainty. The longer a structure of reality remains collectively reinforced, the more invisible that structure becomes to the people operating inside it. At that point, people are no longer consciously defending every assumption one by one. Most assumptions have already been absorbed into the background of perception itself. They shape interpretation automatically because they're treated as normal before they're treated as arguments. This is part of why Plato treats the return to the cave so seriously. The prisoner who leaves and comes back is not simply presenting new information. He's disrupting a shared structure that organizes how the group understands reality. Contradiction can begin feeling socially disruptive in addition to intellectually threatening. The result is that groups can reinforce distorted perception without any deliberate coordination. Often the process is far more passive than everyone being irrational or malicious. People inherit ways of interpreting reality from environments that already exist before them, then reinforce those same interpretations simply by continuing to participate in them. Given time, collective reinforcement creates the impression that certain perceptions are self-evident. And according to Plato, this is one of the most powerful forms of illusion because the distortion no longer appears externally imposed. It begins feeling woven directly into reality itself. For Plato, the movement outside the cave is presented as painful instead of gratifying enlightenment. The prisoner who leaves doesn't immediately recognize the truth with clarity and relief. At first, he struggles to see it all. The world outside the cave feels disorienting because his perception had adjusted to a different structure of reality. A known sense of stability now feels uncertain, and the structure that previously organized understanding no longer functions the same way. This is important because Plato is describing more than intellectual correction. He's describing the destabilization that occurs when familiar perception begins breaking apart. When a person begins seriously examining assumptions that previously felt unquestionable, certainty weakens faster than clarity develops, and the result is a period where perception itself feels unstable. Naturally, people resist that condition because stable perception provides comfort even if it's incomplete, since the feeling of stability reduces uncertainty, allowing reality to feel organized and predictable. This is part of why the prisoner in the cave initially wants to return. The familiar world inside the cave may be limited, but it's understandable. Outside the cave, perception must constantly adjust. The prisoner has to confront the possibility that what once felt self-evident was only a partial understanding shaped by a confined environment. When examination begins seriously enough, a person can no longer return to certainty in the same way. Old assumptions lose some of their stability, but newer understanding still feels incomplete. The result is a tension between no longer fully trusting the old structure while not yet fully feeling grounded in the new one. And according to Plato, this tension is inseparable from philosophy itself, because deep examination disrupts familiar perception before reorganizing it. Plato doesn't treat philosophy as the simple accumulation of information. The prisoner leaving the cave is not merely learning new facts about the world. He's being forced to recognize that the structure he once trusted completely was incomplete before he thought it was. For Plato, that recognition changes the role of philosophy entirely. Philosophy matters because it interrupts passive perception and forces a person to examine structures that had previously become too familiar to question. This is also why Socrates spends so much time exposing contradiction, because contradiction reveals instability inside perceptions that once appeared completely solid. When a person recognizes that their understanding may be less complete than they assumed, examination becomes possible in a way it wasn't before. The result is that philosophy becomes less about collecting conclusions and more about learning how perception itself can become shaped through repetition, familiarity, and inherent assumptions. And according to Plato, this process is difficult to notice precisely because it feels normal from the inside. The cave was never about ignorance. It was about the possibility that human beings can adjust to limited perception so completely that they stop recognizing the limits as limits. The takeaway from the allegory of the cave is people often defend perceptions without fully recognizing where those perceptions came from. Human beings can and will gradually adjust to distorted perceptions while continuing to experience themselves as seeing clearly, which makes illusions difficult to separate from reality. People never consciously choose deception because it develops through their environment, social structures, repeated interpretations, and assumptions that settle before being seriously examined. I just got finished recording this Plato project that I really enjoyed, so I'm going to go sit down and edit it, and then make my own personalized notes and upload those to Substack. You can find all those and some eventual essays written. All that's linked in bio, but to keep me focused and moving forward, this is what I use: Ultra Focus Energy Pack. And honestly, I don't really see immediate effects from supplements that are all natural. You can trace it back to where they're planted, but these actually, they hit.